The first letter that was addressed to the Church of Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, was written by St. Paul. It is in our Bibles. It's in the New Testament. It is known as Romans. You go into any Bible study, they're going to say, turn your Bibles to Romans chapter whatever. That was the first letter written to the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church was founded by Jesus Christ. It was amongst the earliest churches. It was superintended and led by the apostles Peter and Paul, Saints Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul were the first popes of the Roman Church, and so when Paul wrote a letter to the Roman Church, he was writing a letter to the Roman Catholic Church. And what does he say in his letter to the Roman Catholic Church? It's very, very interesting. I did a video about this. It got uploaded today, but I want to add some more to what I said, because a lot of Roman Catholics they really get caught up in this web of thinking, that says, well, it doesn't matter how bad the Roman Catholic Church gets, it doesn't matter how evil a pope may be.
A friend of mine told me that they were going to attend a mass at Santa Marta. Do you want to come? And I told him, okay, but I would really like to write a letter to the Pope. So I went to the mass with this letter in a pocket. In this letter, I was telling that we were same-sex couple with 3 kids, and that we were on the point of introducing our kids to the parish. But I was saying, Holy Father, I want to be sure it's a good thing for them and it cannot be a trauma, it cannot be something bad. But then 3 days after, I got a phone call from an anonymous number. Someone saying, Mr. Rubera, yes, it's me. This is Pope Francis. I called you twice, but you were not answering. I read your letter. It's a beautiful letter. I got your point. And he told me, please, bring your children to the parish. Being transparent with the parish about your family. Of course, not all the people will share your choice of having a family like this. But I think you have to go because it's good for your kids. His message and his advice, it was really useful because we did exactly what he told us. It's the 3rd year that they are attending this kind of spiritual path in the parish, and everything is going okay. He didn't mention which was his opinion about my family. Probably he's following the doctrine on this point, but the attitude towards people has massively changed.
Las personas homosexuales tienen derecho a estar en la familia. Son hijos de Dios, tienen derecho a una familia. No se puede echar de la familia a nadie ni hacer la vida imposible por esa gente. Lo que tenemos que hacer es una ley de convivencia civil. Que tienen derecho a estar cubiertos legalmente. Yo defendí eso.
This morning, Pope Francis shaking up the Catholic Church, supporting same-sex civil unions in the new documentary, Francesco. The Pope says what we have to create is a civil union law. That way they are legally covered. I stood up for that. Words welcomed by Father Jim Martin, an advocate for LGBTQ Catholics.
It's a huge step forward historically. He had said something like this before when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. But it's quite another thing to say it as Pope, and to say it so publicly and so clearly.
Los papas son un muy buen paso en torno a acompañar los cambios sociales, los cambios del acceso a derechos de las personas que puedan tener su libre elección de orientación sexual y no por eso perder derechos como seres humanos.
Con este reconocimiento de Francisco de que nuestras parejas también son familias, de que gays, lesbianas, bisexuales y trans tenemos derecho a formar familia, damos un paso adelante, sobre todo para las personas LGBT de fe. Ahora, cuando él dice, les tenemos que reconocer los derechos de la unión civil, ahí es donde nosotros decimos, bueno, avance, pero no tanto.
This is a clear demonstration of a fundamental principle, which is the principle of non-discrimination. And one of the things that has been very clear in the UN doctrine on this is that non-discrimination is also relevant in the questions of sexual orientation. So this decision of the Pope is, of course, extremely welcome from our perspective.
Doesn't matter how many priests are pedophiles, doesn't matter how many priests are homosexual predators, doesn't matter how many priests are members or citizens of the Republic of Sodom. None of that matters because Jesus Christ said, "Thou art Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail." And so they think no matter how bad things get, God will never give up the Roman church. And it's the exact same mentality as the Pharisees at the time of Christ. Christ told the people, "You see this temple you marvel at so much. You see this temple that you are so much in awe of. It's all coming down, and not a single stone shall stand." And that really angered the priesthood of Israel. That really angered the Pharisaical order, because that temple was the cornerstone. It was the foundation of their entire institution. Without the temple, there was no Jewish priesthood. There was no Pharisaical order. There was nothing. And this was even stated by the Caesar himself after the destruction of the temple. Josephus writes about this. He says that the priests of the temple, after seeing the destruction of their revered monument, rushed to the Caesar and begged for their lives. And the Caesar said, "You have no priesthood of what..." He said, "You have no temple, of what good is your priesthood?" You have no temple, of what good is your priesthood? It is biblical what is said in Josephus. I really think every Christian should read Josephus, because it just sheds so much light on the world of the New Testament. But without that temple, there is no priesthood. And Jesus said it's all coming down. It's all coming down. And that really baffled the minds of the people. It baffled the minds of the priesthood. Why? Well, because when you go to the book of Genesis, what does God tell Abraham? He says, "I will have an everlasting covenant with you, with your people, with your seed." So for Israel, there was this everlasting covenant. There was this everlasting covenant. So they thought God will never give up on the temple. God can never give up on our nation because we're the chosen people. We have an everlasting covenant through Abraham. So either when the temple was destroyed, either God lied or they were misinterpreting what God meant by everlasting covenant. What God meant by everlasting covenant wasn't an everlasting covenant with a people because they were born with a certain DNA. It was an everlasting covenant with his church, with the people of righteousness, with the people who seek after God. St. Paul says something to the likes of, God went to Abraham because Abraham was seeking a city, the foundations of which were built by God. Abraham was searching for God. And the people who have an everlasting covenant with God are not a particular race. They're not of a particular genetic buildup. Just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you are a part of this everlasting covenant, no matter how bad you are, no matter what you do. And so that mentality of, well, God will never give us up. God will never destroy our temple because we have an everlasting covenant. That is the same exact mentality of the Catholics. Because they say, well, God said, Jesus said, "I will build my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail." So no matter how bad the church is, the institution will always be preserved by God. Well, God said, "I will have an everlasting covenant." Jesus said, "The gates of hell shall not prevail." The temple was destroyed. Either God was lying or there was a misinterpretation. Obviously, there's a misinterpretation. And what does St. Paul tell the Roman Catholic Church in the first epistle written by Pope Paul I? What did Pope Paul I say to the Roman Catholic Church in his letter to the Romans? He says, "Just as God cut off the original branches, meaning the temple, meaning the Hebrew priesthood, God will also cut you off." He tells this to the Romans. It's in Romans chapter 11. You can read it for yourself. I talked about it in my last video. So in other words, just as God can destroy the temple, God can also destroy the Vatican. And I've said this numerous times. God destroyed his temple. He founded the temple, he destroyed it. And people have told me, that's not the same thing, it's not the same thing. It's the same thing. It's pretty much the same thing. All right. The big difference is that the Catholic priesthood was established by Jesus Christ when he was on earth. The Jewish priesthood was established by God before the coming of Christ. That's the biggest difference. But nonetheless, just God founded a temple, he destroyed it. God founded the Roman Catholic Church, he can also destroy it. 1527, the Vatican was sacked. Tens of thousands of people were killed. Nuns were raped. It was absolutely horrific. But things like that happened in the history of Israel. The temple was destroyed more than one time. The final destruction of the temple was done by the Romans. So the Vatican was sacked in 1527 by the forces of the Holy Roman Empire, many of whom were Protestants, members of the Germanic Protestant mercenary group, the Landsknecht, or Landsknecht. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. There was a Spanish eyewitness of the sacking of the Vatican in 1527, and he said that the Vatican was riddled with sodomy, it was riddled with idolatry, it was riddled with hypocrisy, it was riddled with evil. I'll read you his quote. Spanish eyewitness, this is what he said, quote, "In Rome, the capital of Christendom, not one bell is ringing, the churches are not open, Mass is not being said, and there are no Sundays nor feast days. The rich merchants' shops are used as horse stables. The most splendid palaces are devastated, many houses burnt, and others the doors and windows broken up and taken away, the streets transformed into dung heaps. The stench of cadavers is horrible. Men and beasts have the same burials. In churches, I saw bodies gnawed at by dogs. I don't know how else to compare this other than to the destruction of Jerusalem." So somebody got it. During the sacking of the Vatican, people weren't sitting there saying like, well, this is unprecedented. No, people understood what was happening. There were people who were aware of what was happening. They saw behind the curtain. They saw behind the veneer. They saw behind the surface, the superficial. And they had an awareness that something divine was happening. Not in the sense that what was happening was holy. There was atrocities, war crimes being done. But in the sense that what was happening was punishment. It was the scourge taking place. It was the anger of God. And why would God be angry at the Vatican? Look at what it says here. "Now I recognize the justice of God, who doesn't forget even if he arrives late. In Rome, all sins were committed quite openly. Sodomy, simony, idolatry, hypocrisy, and deceit. Thus we cannot believe that this all happened by chance, but for divine justice." There were two destructions of the temple that were done before the final destruction by the Romans. So there was a sacking of the Vatican in 1527. Which means it can happen again. And I believe it will happen again. Why? Well, for the same reason why it happened in 1527. Savonarola himself said this. Savonarola stated that he stated that the leadership of the Vatican corrupts young boys. What does that mean? What does that mean but sodomy? What does that mean but pederasty, pedophilia? That was being done in the Renaissance period. And the Pope at this time in 1527, the Pope who was in the Vatican when it was being sacked, Pope Clement VII, he was told by a monastic by the name of Brandano de Petroio. And Brandano de Petroio told Pope Clement VII, "You sodomite bastard, because of you, Rome will be destroyed. Because of you, Rome will be destroyed, you sodomite bastard." So the evils that we see in the Vatican today were being done in the past. Pedophilia, pederasty, sodomy, all these things that were being done. And so, just as God punished the Vatican in the past for these evils, I think the same thing will happen in the future for these types of evils, for these very, very sinister things. And you see right there in the letter to the Romans, the first letter to the Roman Catholic Church by St. Paul, what does he tell the Romans in the first chapter of his epistle? He warns them about Sodom. He warns them about Sodom, and he tells the Roman Church, those who participate in Sodom, God gave them up. Those who participated in Sodom, God gave them up. And what does he tell the Romans later on in the same epistle? Just as God cut off the original branches, the Hebrew priesthood, God will also cut you off. God will also cut you off. God gave up on those who participated in the evils of Sodom, and St. Paul tells them later on, God will give you up. Don't think that God will not give you up. So he warns them about the evils of Sodom, and then he warns them that God will give them up if they turn to evil. Well, what has the Catholic Church turned to in our own time? The Catholic Church has turned to Sodom. The Vatican has turned to Sodom. And the Catholics are drunk off of this hubris that says God will never give us up because we are built on the rock of Peter. The same arrogance, and Paul also warns them about arrogance in chapter 11, the same arrogance that plagued the Jews in the time of Christ. We have Moses as our prophet. We are okay. We have Abraham as our ancestor. We are sons of Abraham. Isn't that what John the Baptist said? He said, do not say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father, for I tell you right now that God can make these very stones into sons of Abraham. Remember back in 2014, and this is an example of what I mean by Rome turning to Sodom. Remember back in 2014, there was the Synod on the Family. It was a very big deal. Why? Because in the Synod on the Family, there were major Catholic leaders who were pushing for Sodom, and they were saying things like, well, citizens of Sodom have many, many gifts that they can offer to the church and all this insanity. And this statement was known as a Latin title, Relatio post disceptationem, which means it means report after debate. So there was a debate. Here is the report that we have come up with. The Latin word deceptationem sounds like deception, and that's what this was, really. It was deception. What this report said was that members of Sodom have things to offer to the church, and we should be more welcoming to Sodom. We should embrace Sodom. That's what this said. And there were cardinals who were pushing for this, priests, bishops, absolute sons of Belial who were pushing for this. And you would think, well, this is Christ's church. Of course, you know, most people leading Christ's church would never accept this, right? I mean, we can expect that, you know, you're going to have at least one Judas, but I mean, the church overall would be against this, right? Well, there was a vote in the synod amongst the bishops, amongst the synod fathers. And this was the result of the vote. Out of all of the synod fathers who voted in the Synod on the Family in 2014, this was almost a decade ago, 118 voted in favor for Sodom, and 62 voted against it. What does this tell me? It tells me the majority of the Catholic Church is in favor for Sodom. And what does St. Paul tell the Roman Catholic Church? Those who participated, who partook, who indulged in Sodom, God gave them up. And he later tells the same Roman Church, God will also give you up. Do not think that you are exempt. Do not think that you are free from being scourged and from being thrown out. You can see in this history of the Roman Catholic Church this record of this type of evil, this type of just sinisterism. For example, I was reading recently about a Renaissance cardinal, Cardinal Bessarion. He was a Greek Catholic cardinal, very close to the papacy, very well connected in the Vatican. He was a direct student of a Greek neo-pagan by the name of Gemistos Plethon. Gemistos Plethon was a neo-pagan who was working to introduce Greek paganism into Renaissance Europe. Part of the Renaissance was a revival of paganism, neo-paganism. And a lot of the stuff that was being taught in the Renaissance era was very much so akin to what we would call New Age ideology, right? That man can ascend to godhood, basically. And there was also a lot of interest in going back to pagan deities, especially Egyptian deities. Greek deities also had a lot of favor, but Egyptian mythology was becoming very, very popular. And you had thinkers like Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino and Johannes Reuchlin. These were all major thinkers in the Renaissance, and they were all pushing for paganism under the veneer of Orthodox Catholicism. Just like today, they will push for Sodom, and they'll say, well, the teachings of the church are still maintained. We're just gonna hug Sodom for for a little bit here. That's it, no problem. Cardinal Bessarion, he was very much in favor of syncretism, synchronizing paganism with Christianity. And he was a direct student of a neo-pagan thinker. In fact, he was a direct student of the foremost neo-pagan thinker in Europe at that time, Gemistos Plethon. So here you have a cardinal, very well connected to the papacy, very well connected to the Vatican, a direct student of a neo-pagan, whose entire mission was to overthrow Christianity. He himself said this, that Christianity and Islam would be overthrown and a new religion would dominate the world, and this religion would be paganism. There was a Catholic thinker who was working to expose this pagan conspiracy in the Vatican. His name was George of Trebizond. George of Trebizond was another Greek Catholic. He was, in fact, the first person to translate Plato into Latin, so a very learned man, very educated. But he was very critical of this neo-pagan movement in the Renaissance. He was exposing Platon. In fact, he confronted Platon to his face because he attended a lecture by Platon in which Platon said that in a few years a new religion will dominate the world. And this was in the Renaissance period, okay, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, 1400s. And George of Trebizond asked Platon, what religion will dominate the world in your view? Will it be Christianity or Islam? And Platon said, none. But a new religion will rise, and it'll be akin to paganism. And Platon believed that eventually there would be this overthrow of the Christian and Islamic religions, and a pagan religion will dominate the world. Essentially, Platon was the Renaissance version of the counter-jihad movement, which sprung up after 9/11. And this was when you had a lot of atheists and neo-pagans come along and say, oh, Islam is so bad, religion is bad, therefore, turn to atheism, turn to paganism. And there was a lot of that going on in the early 2000s and in the 2010s, and they were using Islam as a boogeyman to justify atheism and paganism and even racism in numerous cases. And so George of Trebizond was trying to expose this pagan conspiracy. And do you know who the Vatican favored? The Vatican favored Cardinal Bessarion, the student who was in favor of syncretism, and was a direct student of someone who wanted to overthrow Christianity, over George of Trebizond. So the Vatican was in favor of Cardinal Bessarion over the one who was trying to expose the pagan conspiracy. The Catholic Church favored the pagan conspirator against the one trying to expose the conspiracy. So Vatican II should not be surprising. None of this stuff should be surprising. The majority of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, siding with Sodom, that should not be surprising at all. None of this stuff should be surprising at all. It's just whatever. Now you hear the Pope, and he's saying, oh, yes, we should defend serial killers. They don't deserve the death penalty. We should put them in a nice cage and read them the Bible and have a woman from the local church have a catechism, a Catholic catechesis class with a serial killer, a child rapist, cannibal. Yes, absolutely. Because that is the Christian way, according to Pope Francis. And, oh, yes, let's call cross-dressers daughters of God, hijas de Dios, because those are the Spanish words that he used. And also, let's support homosexual gay unions. That's because Pope Francis, the Holy Father, told us to. And what does Unum Sanctum teach? Unum Sanctum, the great, a very important Vatican Catholic document. What does Unum Sanctum say? It says, if you do not submit to the Pope, you will go to hell. There is no salvation outside of submission to the Roman Pontiff. So we're all damned. If we're against Pope Francis, we're all damned. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.